Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and I'm in Toronto, but my friend is in Geneva, aren't you, Alexander?
Yes, I am.
So I expect to get some new insights about Russia today.
Alexander Likhotal is in Geneva, and he's a
Wise and experienced observer of international affairs, whom it's a great pleasure to introduce to you.
because he is somebody everybody ought to know, and he's now a professor at a university in Geneva. But when I first met him, it was at the top of a mountain in Austria. Do you remember that? And we had been sent there, both of us had been sent there to found a peace university in a castle in Austria, the top of a mountain in Burgenland. And these Russians were walking in, sort of single file into wherever we were. And I remember thinking in those days, it was during the end of the, tail end of the Gorbachev years, and as president. And I had a little thing of trying to figure by looks, could I tell which one was an old one and which one was a young one, a new one of the Gorbachev people. And I thought I could tell. And I saw Alexander, and I thought, yeah, he's a new one for sure. And he was, because in fact, he hadn't even, didn't have his business cards made yet. So he gave me, I guess we exchanged emails or something, but at any rate, you didn't have any business cards ready because you were so new on the job. And wasn't you were the head of something, a diplomatic university or something in Moscow, but turns out within weeks you became Gorbachev's press secretary, right? And so anyway, but I remember the thing, I was confirmed that you were one of the new ones because we were supposed to write the first curriculum for this program in peace studies at this peace university. And everybody was being super polite because this was, days of glasnost and all these good things that were happening. And we started to say, well, we'll put courses on Marxism. And you said, oh, well, I don't think we need courses on Marxism. I don't remember what you preferred, but I think it might have been John Stuart Mill or somebody instead of Marx. And I thought, yeah, he is a new one, all right. Anyway, before long, I got to see you announce the demise of the Soviet Union. You went on TV and you said, well, this is it. And anyway, it was a sad day, but we've kept in touch and it's really wonderful. You were the head of Green Cross International for a long time, and now you're professing. And so let's talk about what you profess. I want to talk about Russia because, I've had a thing about Russia. I've always figured it was up to me to fix Russia. But I don't think I've succeeded very well. Have you succeeded in fixing Russia yet, Alexander?
Sure. Well, lots of news coming from Moscow and Russia, actually.
Yeah.
That's why I responded very eagerly to your invitation, Metta. And sure, I was also thinking, we know each other roughly 40 years already.
Yeah.
Almost 40 years. Time flies.
It's amazing. Anyway, yes, we're going to talk about Russia today. And then we're going to pick another time for you to come back and we'll talk about the post-COVID world, because you have some thoughts about that too. And of course, the topics may overlap a bit. I want to discuss the challenges of this, what looks like a really sour relationship between Russia and almost all the other countries that I more or less identify with. And you're based in Geneva now. So, but I know you were there recently. You went back to Moscow for Gorbachev's, what was it, birthday or something?
Yes, it was birthday, yes.
Do you go often? Moscow?
Well, I used to go more often, but now with the pandemic, so it became much more difficult than it used to be. Mm-hmm. So now not very much, but again, I probably will be in Moscow in the next couple of days.
Oh, you will. Oh, okay. Why don't we start with the current bad news, which was about some altercation almost involving a British warship that went into the Crimean waters.
Well, Meta, we're talking about the case which happened just on Wednesday, and it was the destroyer, British destroyer under the name Defender, which was going close to the Crimea. And obviously, it was just a legal dispute because Russia considers that to be its territorial waters, while United Kingdom, as the rest of the world, do not recognize that Crimea has become Russian. So the destroyer went in the waters which were considered to be Ukrainian. There couldn't be different any protests because there were joint, actions of the fleet of Ukrainian and British fleet at that time, and it was going back from this. But Russia has, of course, considered that it's important to demonstrate to put together a loud demonstration, and there was several bombs which were exploded, as I understand, a couple of miles away from the destroyer, from the British destroyer, and generally it was just to demonstrate the decisiveness of Russia. Russia didn't know that there was the BBC journalist on the board of the destroyer. And he described everything very aptly because he said that they even did not understand that something was happening. There was lots of boats, Russian boats around. There were warnings that there might happen something, that they can start bombing. And they heard somewhere far away a couple of explosions, but it didn't look like it was against this destroyer or as a sort of precursor of any activities against the destroyer. So it was simply a demonstration. And I would say that the real reason of that was just to prove to the domestic audience in Russia that Russia is capable of flexing muscles, and that it is by this it also wanted to convince the people at home that the West have certain aggressive plans against Russia. So it was demonstration on both sides. It's a little bit distressing that this is happening after the Biden-Putin meeting in Geneva. And I assume that it gives certain clues to what has happened there.
Well, of course, the U.S. is doing similar things, flying or sending ships into off the coast of China in the South China Sea that China claims, and and I think there are even test missions in the Arctic. A lot of people are trying to see what happens if we go through there. Nobody's going to get killed, I bet, but it's not a nice thing happening.
It's very difficult to deal with the imaginary conflicts and imaginary wars, because it's easier to conclude the real war than the imaginary one.
That's an interesting point. I never thought about how easy it is to conclude any war, but I always figure once the blood is drawn, you're in for a long ride. But it certainly is hard to turn around hostility. I guess that's in a way the question. Is this hostility between Russia and the rest of the world some sort of residual imaginary hang-up on both sides or one side, or are there new reasons for it? I mean, we've been enemies so long, maybe we've just gotten in the habit of being enemies and we'll stay being enemies whether there's anything to fight about or not. Is that a reasonable interpretation, or are there real, significant interests at stake that that are really hard to resolve? And if so, is anybody even trying to resolve them? Really trying?
Metta, I think that this is not the continuation of the Cold War relationship and Cold War animosities.
No?
I think that this situation has its own reasons. It's not just inertia of the Cold War relationship. I remember that Martin Malia, the well-known American historian, he used
I'm
to
sorry, I
say,
didn't hear the name. Who?
Malia, Martin
Oh, Martin Malia. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Malia. Sorry, maybe
Berkeley. Yeah.
Yes, exactly, Berkeley. And he wrote in his book that the West is not necessarily most alarmed when Russia is in reality most alarming. And it's not most reassured when Russia is in fact most reassured. And the West, I think, is mostly alarmed when it is confused about Russia's policy making, its interests, its strategies. And modern Russia is frightening precisely because it is confusing and unpredictable. Look at Biden-Putin meeting in Geneva just a couple of days or a week ago. The main problem, strategic stability, and that's, if you translate it into normal language, it is a predictability. And unfortunately, the most media responses to the gathering between presidents Biden and Putin focused only on optics of the meeting, examinations of handshakes, non-verbal communication, how Putin was sitting, how Biden was sitting, grins and frowns of both. And actually, it does not give anything for the sort of to draw some conclusions of what has happened, because it's not the idea to consider who won, who lost in Geneva, because it's not a matter of who was projecting strength, resolution, assurance against a shoe and disrupted other participant. But what can be lost in this horse race analysis is the quiet and sometimes even subtle changes to the framework of the relations between the United States and Russia that have reached, it was, accepted by both, that the relations have reached the lowest point after the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And expectations, of course, for the summit were rightly low. No resets were possible. However, the stakes were and are still very high. As Russia and the West have been sleepwalking towards the abyss. Recently I've read Nicholas Gvozdev, the American scholar of Russian origins. Mm-hmm. But he was saying that Biden offered a version of a restart, not a reset. I would not agree. A restart means introducing of new agenda. Mm-hmm. There was no new agenda. No. And I was thinking, just how can I describe it if I stay within this computer speak? Neither reset nor restart. And for me, it may be an attempt to debug the relationship, an attempt to identify and remove bugs from the system of relationships. Was it successful? Can it be successful? Well, what has happened with this destroyer shows that so far not much has changed. And unpredictability has become the code word of Russian foreign policy during the last 10, 12 years after the annexation of Crimea. Modern Russia looks strategically important precisely because it is confusing and unpredictable.
Mhm.
Will Russia reject this element of its policy of strategic containment, which it has been using for these 10, 15 years? Can it afford not using this political tool? I'm not sure. The contradictions go further. The Russian regime can be described as rock solid, but at the same time, extremely vulnerable. It can withstand huge political pressures, but might collapse from a banal ailment. It has always been puzzling that the Western analysis of Russia is transfixed on Putin, on his personality. From the first days, Mr. Putin, who is Mr. Putin? But today, there is no question who is Mr. Putin, but still he is seen as the cause and end of all challenges happening to the country and its policies. Russia is a huge and diverse country, living in several historical epochs. I'm not speaking about, time zones. I'm speaking about that if you go to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, to a couple of other advanced cities, you are in the 21st century. But if you go to the rest of the country, you will find yourself in the 19th, 20th century. And if you will go to Chechnya, Dagestan, and several other, let me say, sultanates on the territory of Russia, it is, I would say, medieval, feudal, or even tribal relationship. Therefore, it is necessary to foster the analysis on Russia, on the general trends of Russia transformation and the core working of this transformation and global transformations, and not on Putin, regardless of his imprint on the current politics. And I think that
If I were to try to take you seriously, it would mean that I wouldn't know how to begin to analyze any situation, because I think what you're saying is that things occur in regions or other time zones that constrain what Putin is doing. And I don't think anybody on the outside could begin to comprehend the scope of these things. And I wonder, is it really, I mean, he does have more power than most leaders of countries. He for sure is in charge of making more of the decisions than, let's say, Biden is. He can't get his own cabinet. I mean, sure, he's got a good cabinet, but he can't get the Congress to pass everything he wants and so on. So, but I don't think that's the kind of limitation that Putin faces. He really has an enormous amount of the power in his own hands, doesn't he?
Well, I would say that yes and no. Yes, he has a lot of power in his hands, but at the same time, he feels, it is the animal feel, that there are limits, red lines to the application of this power. And sometimes it is difficult to understand whether it's him or whether it's a tail that wags the dog.
Mm. He doesn't have a red line when it comes to treating Navalny, for example. He can do what he pleases and seems to absolutely have a free hand to do anything.
I would say that even if you look at the meeting in Geneva between Biden and Putin, it's clear that for Biden, the main issue was China and Russia's place in the emerging confrontation between West and China.
Mhm.
But for Putin, it's different. For Putin, it was a meeting which was necessary for preserving his power and ensuring favorable conditions for the transit of power that has begun already. He needs a controlled de-escalation with the West, but controlled one. He cannot afford to accept de-escalation, which he will not be controlling, because the enmity to the West is one of the founding conditions of the smoothness of the transition for Russia. The United States means much more than vice versa. And United States have become for Russia an intra-system factor. The relationship is a reaffirmation of the power that remains the backbone of the Russian system. America also plays the role of the enemy when the Kremlin needs a means to mobilize the society, whether it's against Navalny, whether it's against anybody else. It's very convenient to unite the people around the external threat.
Mhm.
And the weaker the legitimization of power through elections, which has already happened with Putin, the more the enemy is needed for him.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, no other nation arouses such strong feelings in the Russian elite as the United States. America reproduces in uh, both, let me say, the Weimar syndrome for Russia and also some, which will never be recognized, but some kind of gloating over America's anticipated decline.
Okay.
It's very difficult to combine both, but somehow Putin achieves that.
Mhm.
The United States is playing a systemic role for power's logic. It is for power logic for Putin. The worst thing is if America starts ignoring Russia, not noticing Russia. But Russia can find a way to return the attention. Recall what happened in April with the escalation near Ukrainian borders.
Mhm.
In my sincere judgment, that was done with one goal: to bring back the attention of Biden, United States, to Russia after being called the killer. And we must say he succeeded. I mean, Putin succeeded in doing that.
Mhm.
And the fact that Washington is trying to smooth out a confrontation with Moscow suggests that there is both an awareness of the dangers in ignoring Russia and a hope for the benefits of a dialogue. Most importantly, I would say, Biden has come to the conclusion that it is more costly to isolate Putin rather than to start this kind of controlled de-escalation together with him. But both understand this balance in their own way. And as a result, we see constant swings.
Mhm.
Every attempt by Moscow and Washington to reset ends in enmity, or swings to enmity, then another attempt. It's
Mhm.
clear why. The coincidence of tactical interests is unable to mitigate the incompatibility of systemic principles of both parties. Both want de-escalation, but there are different underlying principles for both. It is not yet evident that the West as a whole has a strategy towards Russia. Just Look at what has happened just a day before, or 2 days. 2 days before, Macron and Merkel suggested to have a summit, European summit with Putin. Well, Biden had it. Why Europe shouldn't? And suddenly there is a wave of counter-reaction on the part of the European nations. So today it was announced that the idea has been given away, trashed. There are no plans of having such a meeting in the near future.
You mean Biden told him to stop it? He didn't want it to happen.
No. Biden was before Macron and Merkel invited after that. Exactly thinking that if Biden meets with Putin, why don't we? Europe should also.
So why has it been killed? If you think Biden was okay with it, wouldn't Putin want it also? I'm not sure why it's been trashed.
You forget, Metta, that Europe is still sovereign and consists of sovereign countries. That happened because 7 heads of state of European nations said that they are not going to meet Putin. As simple as that.
Okay.
They consider.
There was a lot of talk about here.
It was started by the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and he explained, listen, after downing Boeing in Ukraine, where we have lost 200 people, I cannot just sit with him at the same table as if nothing has happened. And of course, there were Poland, there were other countries which refused to do that. It is indeed difficult to build a policy towards an entity, I mean Russia, that exists at the expense of continuing ambivalence. To be against the West, to be with the West, and to be within the West. And all that together. Russia demonstrates the highest class of eclecticism today. And the Kremlin never tires of claiming that the United States is in decline. Putin insists that the United States is firmly marching right along the path of the Soviet Union, with all the BLM happenings in the United States, this split practically 50-50 of the social, let me say, base and electoral base in the United States, all of that.
Well, can you disagree with him?
I can.
You can?
I can. But I think we will have
always
discussion about the United States then.
Yeah, we've always been on different sides. I think you've been more pro-American and I've been pro-Russian more than the opposite. We once talked about trading countries. But I must say, I think, that I used to be so sympathetic and sort of, frankly, pity my Russian friends having such a terrible government. And I think the U.S. and we don't have to pursue this line of conversation, but it's been tragic the last few years. And let's only hope that it's turning around, but I don't know whether I have any hope or not. You think too?
I agree with you, but still I think that the institutions that have been created 250 years ago by a very clever people, very intelligent people at that time, they do work. And I feel and I see that they still are working today. I'm saying that it's on the part of Russian leadership, it's a kind of political schizophrenia. But there is a power in it because the audience, Russian audience, likes these discussions because of the Weimar syndrome. But, you know, I, I, I cannot understand. If the age of America is coming to an end, why demand respect from the United States and complain about its threats? And why agree to summits and even trying to force the other side to initiate the summit? The irony is that while both sides are searching for common ground, they find themselves in the shadow of the Chinese dragon, who is waiting for a chance to take advantage of the enmity between Russia and the United States. The fact that Biden didn't roll out painful sanctions against Russia before the summit and even postponed the planned June 2nd sanctions for poisoning Navalny is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. That means, as I read it, that for Biden, the Kremlin's acrimony appears to be more dangerous than discontent in his own camp, demanding toughness against Russia. Washington has to painfully find a way to combine the struggle for democracy and the need to engage in geopolitics with Russia. Each time it has to choose which is more important: Ukraine, Navalny, freedom, human rights, or missiles, cyberspace, Syria, Iran, Afghanistan.
Mhm.
So far, no American president has managed to solve this dissonance problem. No one.
Mhm.
And still, against the backdrop of collapsed Russian-American relations, the Geneva summit looks like a success. The end of the war of embassies, the decision to start consultations on security and regional conflicts, on cyber security, suggest a willingness to come out of the trenches. The leaders' respectful comments about each other, very reserved comments about each other. Biden was saying we had a positive conversation. Putin, we speak the same language. And later, he was claiming already when he came back that Biden is a very sharp politician and sharp negotiator. But and I would say that it prompts that they have found a kind of a common denominator for institutionalizing the relationship between the two countries. It is just, the idea. It's not yet guaranteed, but at the same time, they remain on different sides of ideological and I would say world viewers barricades. They look at the world absolutely differently. And their talks were not about seeking trust. It was a conversation about interests and how to advance them in a way that would not cause a collapse of the system of relationship. The attempt by Washington and Moscow to find an updated and again debugged form of peaceful coexistence is just beginning. It was the first step. Many things can just collapse this. And I would say that the conciliatory tone of the summit, however, does not even guarantee a cold peace between Russia and the United States. Cooperation between the nuclear powers in the absence of trust between them mm, is like walking a tightrope over a precipice without a safety net.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
I was
very
wondering when you're going to talk about, the nuclear, negotiations, because, that's something that I think about most. I assume that the Crimea dispute will never end. I mean, certainly Russia's not going to give Crimea back to Ukraine, and certainly Europe and the rest of the West is not in the US too, is never going to say, well, okay, we forget about that now. It's time is enough time has passed to let's talk about other matters and accept Crimea. I don't think that's going to happen. So we're going to be frozen in that particular kind of issue for indefinitely. But at the same time, there've got to be some decisions made about, say, beyond the New START treaty. Thank God there's going to be at least a revival of the New START treaty. But for example, one of the things that the people here have been pushing on Biden was to ask him to bring up the question of no first use, or what is now called sole purpose, and to bring it up. Now, I saw nothing in any of the communiques afterward indicating that they had talked about that. And I probably think they probably didn't. But, Biden, before he was elected, was on record as favoring the adoption of no first use policy. That would be quite a good start. Beyond, I mean, the New START thing is it's lovely, but it's not much of anything. But a no first use policy on both sides would be worth writing home about.
Metta, I think that ideally, of course, it would be very good and it would provide a very important step in confidence building measures for both sides. But I would be majorly surprised if this could have been reached and if this is even reachable in the near future. And not only because of the enmity of the both sides. Simply, the situation has gone much further in terms of the arms race than it used to be at the time of the meeting in Geneva between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. We live in a different world with absolutely qualitatively different stakes and threats. At that time, 30 years ago, nuclear weapons was something which was the ultimate weapon. Today, the nuclear shells are being done, with a very low nuclear yield.
To make them usable on the battlefield.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember even when I was writing my thesis dissertation, I read a very interesting article at that time that after miniaturization of nuclear armaments, it will be possible to use nuclear arms on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. And this prophecy has already happened. It is possible because the damage is comparable to the damage of the ordinary armaments. But I understand that it is just the beginning. The psychological threshold is crossed, then the ladder of escalation is open. But in addition to that, we still have a lot of other problems. Supersonic cruise missiles, which are practically not targetable today, and they are very cheap. And that provides a possibility to overcome practically any defenses of any country. And they could be equipped with these miniature nuclear arms as well. And that means that without taking into account, without linkages between nuclear weapons and modern nuclear weapons, it will be impossible to move ahead. And you remember probably to what extent it was difficult to delink nuclear weapons from the other. And even after that happened, there were some margins which were granted for the Soviet Union because it didn't have the same ability to achieve the territory of the United States as the United States. And according to the START treaty, the Soviet Union had got the right to accumulate more missiles on its territory and different kinds of linkages. That's why I'm saying that I myself signed this appeal for non-first use of nuclear weapons when it was issued. But frankly, inside, I understand why it didn't happen, and I am unfortunately convinced that in the near future it will not happen.
Okay. That you've really ruined my week. I had some hope that there might even be some move in that direction. But,
over the weekend.
yeah, we've got another couple of days. Okay. Well, I mean, let's move back to the initial part of our conversation, because you early on said you think that the enmity between, say, the Russia and the US is not just a continuation of the Cold War, but something new. Now, what I still don't understand is, what is the basic conflict? What is there that is real about the conflict that can't be actually accommodated or solved? I don't know what the fight is about. I know what Crimea, the invasion of Crimea was about. I know what Navalny is about, but these are, that's not what the whole thing is about. And yet, and I don't think that it was equally started on both sides. I think it really was started more by Putin than, and I think to this day, Americans don't have much against Russians. They just have a whole lot against Putin. And I do too, that's sort of the way I feel about it. But my sense is that Russians have things against me, that Russians have things, antipathy toward and anger and hostility toward Westerners, and especially, of course, the US. That it's more than a fight over policy. So what I want to know is, what are we fighting about, really?
Mira, I've mentioned that it is an imaginary conflict and imaginary war. And I mean that because it started practically. It started after the Munich speech of Putin in 2007 at the Security Conference. It was a kind of declaration where the Russia is going. And after the Ukrainian and Crimean episode, it has become inevitable because it is rooted not in the international relations. It is rooted in the domestic politics in Russia, unfortunately. And the regime has come to the limits of its legitimization in normal situation. In order to legitimize the continuing being in power, it is necessary to have the external threat. And Russia is too big. Who else could be an external threat for Russia but for the United States? On one hand, it is very dangerous because it's kind of externalization of the domestic politics of Russia. On the other hand, it still gives birth to certain hopes that no dramatic steps will be taken for the sake of, convincing domestic audience to support the current regime. Though, of course, we should be ready for some inclement weather, because I think that the space of the support of Putin regime is shrinking. That is the biggest reason why all the legislation was adopted recently, according to which Navalny he has been arrested, and he has already been there for almost 5 months, close to half a year. There, every day we receive the information that new and new politicians on the Russian landscape has been taken into custody or simply forbidden to participate in normal political activity. Today was the latest one. He was simply not registered for the parliamentary elections simply because he knew Navalny. Can you imagine that to be a legal reason not to register a person for electoral campaign? But I'm saying that simply that is happening because Putin and the regime are scared to lose the power. And they're trying to cut the grass as short as possible before the September elections to Duma. And at the same time, they're losing sort of, support within the system, within the governance, within the structures of the political power in Moscow, because there is an ongoing fight between several centers of power inside Moscow, between the power ministries and centers, between the presidential administration, between the prime minister as an institution. It's tremendous undercover battle now going on in Moscow.
Do you know of a particular constellation of forces that actually could or aspires to be able to challenge Putin?
Metta, I would say that Putin is thinking of the transit of power. I am sure about that. Simply, he wants to assure that the system does not collapse during the transition. He wants to make it as smooth as possible. Look, for instance, at the I don't know, I will be going in domestic politics if this is of interest, but just recently, the United Russia Party, which is the main power party in Russia, had its pre-electoral campaign session, Congress. Everybody was expecting that there will be either Medvedev, who is the official leader of the party, to be the, let me say, the person that represents the country to the electorate, number one, in the electoral list, or Mishustin, the prime minister, who is also well known. Okay, Medvedev does have a very big negative rating inside the country. So this is clear why it happened. They didn't want to make him a leader. But with Mishustin, he has a positive rating. He's considered a technical prime minister who achieved certain results, etc., etc. And why did it happen? Now there are 5 people nominated. Number 1, Minister of Defense, Shoigu. Number 2, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, etc., etc. No one of them will ever be running for their position as the member of the parliament. They do not need that. And this happened exactly because of that, because Mishustin is becoming a kind of independent political force on the political landscape inside the country, and being nominated as number 1 in the electoral lists of the party will enhance his position vis-a-vis the administration of the president. So there are constant struggles between several centers, prime minister, several power ministries. That does not mean that they are looking for the ways to put out Putin, but they were thinking how to put in their candidate as a successor to Putin.
Okay. Well,
And
that sounds normal.
when it happens after 20 years, more than 20 years, that is not normal.
Okay, fair enough. You use this interesting expression, Russia a
Loose cannon.
yes, a loose cannon. And I guess, a loose cannon is exactly an unpredictable thing.
Exactly.
That
That's why
is what I
called it
think
that.
you're saying, that the unpredictability, but is that, I take that as a reflection of Putin's personal character. Again, you're going to say it's because I'm focused too much on Putin, but that Putin is not a strategist, that Putin is a tactician, that whenever he sees an opportunity, he'll grab it, but without necessarily thinking of the big picture or the long term. No?
Yes and no. I would say that he has a vision, long-term vision where he wants the country to be.
Mm-hmm.
And he is a good tactician, as you said, ready to use any weaknesses in order to gain points. But what is missing, the strategy which connects vision and tactics.
Mm-hmm.
That is missing. But the real reason is not this. The real reason of this is that Putin has started to use a very dangerous tool, dangerous for Russia, first of all. It is I would say, the psychological deterrence. Psychological deterrence or even containment, which is pretending that Russia is more powerful than it is. It is the deterrence from the weak position.
Mm-hmm.
And for that matter, he chooses weak points, uses them in order to demonstrate the power of the country. And thus he demonstrates that the country, Russia, still has the clout and the power to be one of the first countries in the world in terms of its influence. And it creates a negative result because for the world, Russia becomes one of the most dangerous sources of threats and dangers in the world because of that. And how can you call a country, well, let's call it a superpower? You know, after the meeting with Biden in Geneva, I received from one of my friends a cartoon. That's a photo of the meeting, of the first photograph, where they stand, three of them. In the center, President of Switzerland, Parmelan. To the right, President Biden. To the left, President Putin. On top of all of them, in the frames, minimal wages for the country. Switzerland, 4,500 Swiss francs monthly minimal wage. United States, $2,500. Russia, $127. And then the question mark, who is the great power?
Yeah.
You know, the situation, economic situation, is in shambles in the country. Actually, it has been stagnating, and now it has been stagnating for over 8 years. And while the rest of the world seems to be recovering from the economic crisis, from the pandemic, which created also a sort of crisis, Russia does not. The growth within 1%, which is practically no growth in Russia. And if you will take the Brezhnev time, which was called the stagnation, at that time, Soviet Union has been accumulating 1.7%, twice as much as during the last 10 years of Putin.
How much of that is Putin's fault and how much of it is because of sanctions?
No, absolutely not. And I would say that it were not sanctions that did it. It was the closing of the country. You know, when there is no freedom in the country, you know very well business will not go. If there is
China
no,
does. You know, there's no
if
freedom
there
in
is no
China, but look, they're
transparency,
going gangbusters.
if there is no transparency, if there is no rule of law, if they can take American businessmen and put him to jail, as it happened with several of them, nobody will be investing into the country. And the money has been fleeing from the country outside because people, even wealthy Russians, do not trust this regime.
Okay.
So this is the basic problem.
What about the Magnitsky things? What about countries that apply the Magnitsky law, or say that they sanction the officials? Does that have any influence on things like economic?
It was calculated. It was within the framework of $3 billion.
Really? Okay.
Negligible.
I see.
You know, most important when they're targeted on specific people, then it might work. But as I told you, every country from Germany to whole of Europe to the United States, they have to report to their people. And they do not want to save Russia at the expense of domestic sacrifices in their countries. And I cannot, be critical of that. Russia will recover by itself. Of course, the friendly surrounding will be a very favorable factor for that. But I don't think that anybody should be thinking that a third country could come and recover the economic situation, the political situation, or anything. And again, from what I see, how things are evolving, I have an impression that things have accelerated tremendously during the pandemic period. The change of constitution, of course, many people were not happy with how the country was recovering from pandemics. And now Russia seems to be one of the leaders in terms of the deaths because of the pandemics. Yes. So far,
I hear that people are not getting vaccinated, that they're not the first batch of them did very quickly, but then there's a lot of resistance now.
There are COVID deniers everywhere in the United States, in Europe, everywhere we have them. But in different countries, this is a fraction of the society. In Russia, and this is exactly the demonstration to what extent people do not trust this regime. They lied to us on many other issues. That means that probably they are lying to us with the vaccine. That's why they do not vaccinate. Okay.
Good. Thank you so much.